When Act 3 picks up, Macbeth is still at kind of this like interesting point of return. The dagger soliloquy is a moment when he should look around with some rationality and say, I don't know that this is good for me. I don't know that thinking about murdering the king is good for me, let alone actually murdering the king. But in Act 3, when he says, "'Tis nothing to be thus, but to be safely with us," he begins to think through the consequences of this and to think through the next prophecy, right? He knows that he's going to be king, but he also knows that Banquo's sons are going to become king. And he says, if that's so, which of course it is, right? But if that's so, for Banquo's sons have I defiled my mind. For them, the gracious Duncan have I murdered. Interesting that even in death, he can't help but think of Duncan as gracious. He doesn't say, now that he's that vile traitor Duncan, right? He still thinks of him as gracious. Put rancors, canker sores, right? Blisters in the vessel of my peace only for them, and mine eternal jewel given to the common enemy of man to make them kings, the seed of Banquo kings. You can see this sense of anger. I've done all these awful things to myself, right? Defiled my mind, rancors in the vessel of my peace, eternal jewel, maybe synonymous with his soul, which he's given to the devil, or to death, right? Or to some kind of to just evil in general. He's given himself over to evil action in order to make Banquo's kids kings, right? The obvious sense of this should be like, this was very foolish, and even in the knowledge of what he knew, that his kingdom was going to be supplanted by Banquo's sons. Those are the prophecies. Very foolish to do this thing. And yet his response ultimately is to solve guilt with more guilt. He feels bad, but at the end of this at the end of this scene, he's taken these murderers and he's gotten them to go kill Banquo. The end of his soliloquy, he says, "Come fate into the list and champion me to the utterance." All right, I think you could read this in two ways. The list is like that medieval joust, right? Like two knights line up and they got their lances and they charge at each other, crash into each other, and someone lives and someone gets hurt. Maybe they both get hurt. I think you could see this as Macbeth asking fate to help him, right? Like, I'm in the list, suiting up and ready to go to war with Banquo, or ready to go to war to maintain my crown. So help me, fate. Champion me to the utterance, right? Like, bring me to the place of victory. Maybe he's asking fate to aid him, but he knows that fate already has crowned Banquo's sons kings, right? So he's asking fate to go against itself, which doesn't make sense. Even if you see him not as asking for help, but as kind of like, come on, fate, come into the list, right? And I'll win. He's challenging fate, defying the very power through which he gained the crown. Obviously, he's got a lot of faith in fate. He killed the king, right? That's not like something you just randomly do if you don't think you're going to get away with it. For some reason, Macbeth does think he's going to get away with it, and that's because he believes in this promise of fate. And yet here, on the side of now having achieved the crown, he seems to believe that fate's going to help him keep it, which is very illogical and underscores two central contradictions for him. One, this kind of natural human reality of how to solve guilt, and he solves it with more guilt. He says, I will handle the shakiness of my conscience by committing more murder, right? Like, that's a very contradictory stance to take. And then within the logic of the play, he seems to show either an alarming distrust of fate's promises or a foolish belief that he can stand in the way of fate, both of which don't seem to be the same Macbeth, the guy who kind of took his fate and said, I believe this so much that I'm willing to do this risky thing of trying to kill the king. Now he's like, well, of course, fate's going to continue to support me in the crown, even though he knows that the crown is going to Banquo's sons.